The world had shrunk to the taste of dust and the smell of black powder. 1886, the Wyoming Territory was a raw, open wound on the map of the West, a place where the relentless wind seemed determined to scour away not just the topsoil, but the very distinction between progress and destruction. For Isaac Hawthorne, a rancher whose land stood in the path of the Union Pacific's relentless march, the world was the worn leather of his saddle and the unending thunder of dynamite. The fight for the Sweetwater Valley had been a slow-motion meat grinder, a brutal acre-by-acre struggle that had eroded the souls of the men who fought it. The railroad baron, Bartholomew Kane, called it the artery of the nation, the final passage before the continent could be truly conquered. On the other side of that passage, local ranchers, settlers, and the displaced tribes fought a losing battle. Caught in the middle were the Chinese laborers, brought in by the thousands to lay the track, then discarded. They were ghosts in their own lives, hated by the white settlers and exploited by their employers. Phone, the unforgiving leader of the local Tong, had ordered his people to resist, to vanish into the hills, to fight to the last. There was no surrender in their vocabulary. That was the catechism Isaac had learned by heart. So when he and his men stumbled upon a hidden encampment in the abandoned silver mine north of his property, they expected only two outcomes: a final, desperate fight with hatchets and improvised weapons, or the grim silence of mass suicide, a horror whispered about in the bunkhouses. What they found instead was a handful of terrified, half-starved Chinese men and a small group of women, their traditional silk tunics tattered and stained with grime and rock dust. They had been cooks and laundresses for the railroad gangs, but the haunted look in their eyes told a more complicated story. Among them was a young woman named Lin Mai. She couldn't have been more than 19. Her face was a mask of stoic resolve, but her hands, clenched into tiny fists at her side, betrayed a terror so profound it was almost silent. The stories told in the camps had been clear. The American ranchers were white devils, brutal men who would inflict unspeakable horrors upon captured women before leaving their bodies for the coyotes. Mai had recited the oaths with her companions, death before dishonor, yet when the moment came, when the towering, dust-covered foreigners stormed their sanctuary, rifles held at the ready, the final sharp release of death did not materialize. Instead, there was shouting in a harsh, guttural language, the glint of steel barrels, and then a strange, almost baffling order. The men were separated from the women, and the women were herded towards Isaac's ranch, a few miles south across the rolling sagebrush. No brutality, no leering smiles, just a weary, methodical efficiency. The processing was a blur of confusion. A grizzled old ranch hand, his face a roadmap of sun and hardship, briefly examined them for injuries. They were given a small portion of jerky and water from a clean barrel, the tough, salty meat and cool water a shock to their systems. Then they were led into a large, sturdy barn. The air inside was thick with the scent of hay, horses, and dry wood. And it was there that Mai saw it. A row of simple wooden bunks built against the far wall. They were nothing more than rough-hewn planks with a thin straw-stuffed mattress and a single coarse wool blanket. To the ranchers, they were standard bunkhouse furniture, a meager comfort in a world of hardship. To Mai, they were an unimaginable luxury. She had spent the last 2 months sleeping on a thin reed mat laid upon the cold, damp earth of the mine floor. The idea of sleeping on an elevated surface, protected from the dirt and the chill, seemed like a dream of a forgotten life. As dusk settled, casting long, eerie shadows across the valley, a new wave of confusion washed over her. The American ranchers, Isaac and his hands, began to file into the same barn. They didn't speak to the Chinese women, barely even looked at them. They simply walked to their own bunks, arranged along the opposite wall, shucked off their dusty boots with groans of relief, and lay down. They were mere feet away. Mai's heart hammered against her ribs. In her culture, the proximity of unmarried men and women, especially in a sleeping arrangement, was a violation of the deepest codes of conduct. It was a prelude to shame, an invitation to dishonor. She and the other women exchanged fleeting, terrified glances. They were trapped. The devils were all around them. Yet, as the minutes turned into an hour, nothing happened. The only sounds were the distant boom of railroad dynamite, the mournful cry of a coyote, and the soft, steady breathing of the sleeping men. They had simply gone to sleep. They lay on their backs, their hats and gun belts beside their bunks, vulnerable in their exhaustion. They were not monsters in the dark. They were just tired men. This profound, inexplicable disconnect between expectation and reality was more terrifying than any anticipated cruelty. The enemy was supposed to be a caricature of evil, a simple target for hatred. But this quiet, unassuming humanity was a puzzle she could not comprehend. Mai lay stiffly on the strange yielding surface of the bunk, her body a knot of tension. The wool blanket was rough against her skin. She stared into the oppressive darkness of the barn, her eyes fixed on the silhouetted forms across the narrow aisle. The men she was taught to believe were beasts were sleeping like children. The comfort of the bed felt like a trick, the silence a lie. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Yet the only real battle was the one raging inside her own mind, a war between a lifetime of indoctrination and the bewildering evidence of her own senses. She clutched the edge of the blanket, her knuckles white. Out there in the dust and the dark, Bartholomew Kane was pushing his iron horse forward, and Phone was preparing his followers for a final, desperate resistance. The fate of the valley was being decided in black powder and blood. But for Mai, the entire world had contracted to the space of this barn, to the few feet of air that separated her from the sleeping enemy. The question hung in the dry air, unanswered, as she waited for the dawn. The dawn arrived, not with light, but with a change in the cadence of violence. The overnight blasting had been a slow, methodical heartbeat of destruction. The morning brought the frantic crackle of rifle fire and the sharper explosions of dynamite, closer now. Mai had not slept. She had watched the slow rise and fall of the Americans' chests, listening to their murmurs in a language that sounded like stones rolling downhill. Nothing had happened. The great unspoken terror of the night had dissolved into a grey, anticlimactic morning. The ranchers awoke with the practiced groans of exhausted men pulling on their stiff, worn boots. They moved with a purpose that ignored the Chinese women, their presence acknowledged only by a shared confined space, like furniture in a room. Isaac Hawthorne felt the familiar ache in his lower back as he sat up. His eye scanned the barn, first checking on his own men, then out of habit, on his livestock, and finally, on the silent row of Chinese women. He saw the dark circles under their eyes, the rigid way they held themselves. He saw fear, but it was a different kind of fear now. Not the wild panic of capture, but a watchful, unnerving stillness. His gaze briefly met Mai's before she quickly looked away, her head bowed. There was a small, festering cut on her hand, which he had noticed yesterday. It needed cleaning. That was his job. His job was to fix what was broken, whether it was a fence post, a lame horse, or a person. He approached her slowly, holding up a small tin of salve and a clean rag. "It's okay," he said, his voice soft. He used the tone he reserved for spooked horses and lost calves. Mai flinched, pulling her hand back. The other women stiffened. Isaac stopped, holding his hands out, palms open to show he held no weapon. He pointed to her cut, then to his tin of salve, a simple pantomime of help. After a long, tense moment, she hesitantly extended her hand. His touch was professional and surprisingly gentle. He cleaned the wound with a water-dampened cloth, the sting of the antiseptic salve making her gasp. He worked in silence, his movements economical and sure. When he was done, he wrapped a clean strip of cloth around her palm. He offered a small, tired smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, then retreated to his side of the barn. Mai stared at the white bandage. It was a stark, clean mark against her dirt-stained skin. The act was so simple, so devoid of malice, that it was utterly bewildering. The stories had no framework for this. Devils did not tend to the wounds of their victims. "Don't get too friendly with them, Isaac," a voice grumbled beside him. It was Gus, a wiry, older ranch hand whose face was a permanent mask of suspicion. "My brother was killed by tong hatchet men building the pass at Donna. They don't deserve our bandages." "She's a girl, Gus. And that cut could go bad," Isaac replied, not looking up from packing away the salve. "She's one of them," Gus shot back in a low voice. "I see the way she watches everything. Her eyes ain't scared. They're counting. Counting men." Counting rifles. Don't be a fool, he spat a stream of tobacco juice near the barn door. Isaac didn't answer. He knew Gus's view was the more common one, forged in the crucible of frontier life where compassion was often seen as a liability. But Isaac had seen too much death to believe it was that simple anymore. That evening, the routine repeated itself. The weary ranchers returned, filling the barn with their heavy presence. This time, Mai watched Isaac. She saw him meticulously clean his rifle, his movements patient and deliberate. She saw him sit on the edge of his bunk and pull a worn leather wallet from his vest pocket. He opened it and stared for a long time at a small, creased photograph inside. A flicker of an unfamiliar emotion crossed his face, a deep, painful longing that was so intensely personal, it felt like a secret she had stumbled upon. It was an expression she understood perfectly. It was the same look she'd seen on the faces of young Chinese men before they were sent to their deaths on a dangerous blasting crew. It was the look of a man who desperately wanted to be somewhere else, with someone else. The bunk was still an alien comfort. The proximity of the men was still a source of deep unease. But the questions in her mind were shifting. The broad, monolithic fear of the white devil was beginning to fracture, replaced by 1,000 smaller, more complex questions about this one man. He was not a monster. He was a rancher who bandaged his enemy's hand and carried a picture of a loved one in his pocket. The logic of the conflict, as she had been taught it, was simple: resist or die. But nothing about this barn was simple. Gus's open hostility was, in its own way, more comforting than Isaac's quiet decency. You knew how to react to hatred. How were you supposed to react to kindness from your sworn enemy? As Isaac tucked the photograph away and lay down to sleep, Mai felt a new and even more unsettling thought take root in her mind. Perhaps the most dangerous thing in this barn wasn't the American ranchers, but the slow, corrosive drip of doubt that was beginning to wash away everything she had ever believed to be true. Several days bled into one another, each defined by the same tense routine. The distant thunder of Kane's railroad crews was a constant companion, a reminder of the violent world just beyond the barn walls. Inside, a fragile, unspoken truce had formed. Mai and the other women had begun to accept the offered rations, eating slowly, cautiously, as if expecting the food to be poisoned. Mai found herself tracking Isaac's movements. She noted the way he shared a pouch of tobacco with another rancher, the exhaustion in his posture as he repaired a broken harness, the brief unguarded moment he'd close his eyes before heading out on another long ride to check his fences. These were tiny human details, and each one was a chisel chipping away at the monolithic image of the devil. Gus's suspicion, however, had curdled into a palpable hostility. He watched Mai with a hawk's intensity, his hand often resting on the butt of his Colt revolver. "She ain't right, boss," Gus reported one afternoon to Isaac, who was inspecting a section of fence Kane's men had torn down. "Always watching, never speaks. It's unnatural. Back on the rail lines, they'd smile at you one second and slip a knife in your ribs the next." Isaac, a man bound by his own code of honor, listened with a weary patience. "Keep an eye on her, Gus, but my orders on this ranch are clear. No mistreatment. They're worth more to us alive than dead." Gus tipped his hat, but his eyes, when they met Mai's later, were cold with conviction. He saw a threat, and he was just waiting for it to reveal itself. The reveal, when it came, was not what he expected. It arrived with a scream and a flash of orange fire. Kane's men, in a bold move to drive Isaac off his land for good, launched a direct raid on the ranch house and barn at dusk. It wasn't a battle, it was an extermination. Sticks of dynamite arced through the twilight sky. There was no time to react. The whistle was a split-second premonition followed by a deafening, earth-shattering explosion that blew the main barn doors off their hinges. The world dissolved into a cacophony of splintering wood, the terrified shrieks of horses, and the screams of men. A geyser of dirt and splinters ripped through the side of the barn. Banks were overturned, supplies scattered. The air, thick moments before with hay and sweat, now tasted of burnt powder and iron. Isaac, who had been organizing supplies, was thrown against a support beam, his head ringing. He scrambled to his feet, his training from years of frontier survival kicking in, a frantic calm descending over him. "Lights, get the lanterns," he yelled, his voice raw. Men were groaning. One ranch hand lay eerily still. Another was clutching his leg, blood pulsing between his fingers. And Ben, the young ranch hand Isaac had been mentoring, was on the ground, a large dark stain rapidly spreading across his chest from a wound high on his shoulder. In the chaos, Gus's first instinct was for his weapon. He scrambled for his rifle, his eyes darting to the Chinese women huddled together in terror. "On the ground, all of you, on the ground now," he shrieked, his voice cracking with adrenaline. To him, this was the moment he had predicted. The perfect opportunity for an attack from within. Isaac was a whirlwind of motion, a man against a tide of blood. He pressed a wadded-up shirt against one man's wound, shouting instructions to another. "Pressure, hold it there. Don't let up." He saw Ben and knew it was bad. A wood splinter had acted like shrapnel, severing an artery. Ben's face was already a ghastly pale white. Isaac lunged for him, but another wounded man cried out, his arm mangled. Triage was a cruel master. "Who do you save?" "I need pressure on Ben," he yelled over his shoulder to anyone who could hear. "Now, somebody!" But the other able-bodied men were either wounded, in shock, or returning fire. Gus was too busy keeping his rifle aimed at the huddled women. Ben was bleeding out. I saw it all in a series of stark, terrifying snapshots. The splintered wood, the smell of blood, Gus's face contorted with fear and hate. And Isaac, his expression not of a monster, but of a desperate leader overwhelmed by death. She saw the pulsing wound on Ben's shoulder and knew with the certainty of her limited training, her father in their village had been a healer, that he had only moments to live. The voice of the Tong leader screamed in her head. "The enemy is weak. This is your chance. An enemy dead is a victory for our people. Do your duty." But another image pushed its way through the panic, Isaac gently bandaging her hand. Isaac looking at the worn photograph in his wallet. Gus bellowed at her again. "I said stay down." But Mai was no longer listening to him. She wasn't listening to the voice of the Tong leader either. She was moving. Scrambling on her hands and knees, she crossed the invisible line that divided the barn. She ignored Gus's rifle, ignored the shouts, and fell to her knees beside the dying young man. Without hesitating, she pressed the heel of her hand directly into the wound, pushing down with all her weight, just as she had been taught. The gush of hot blood soaked her hands and forearms. It was shocking in its warmth, its vitality. She leaned in, her small frame trembling, using her body to apply the desperate, life-saving pressure. The raid ended as suddenly as it began, the attackers driven off into the darkness. An unearthly silence descended, punctuated by the whimpers of the wounded. Isaac, having stabilized the other man, turned and saw the scene. He froze. The Chinese girl, the quiet prisoner, was covered in an American rancher's blood, her face a mask of intense concentration, her hand saving his life. Gus stood over her, his rifle still leveled, his expression a disbelieving wreck of confusion and shock. The lines were gone. There was no American side or Chinese side. There was only the living, the dying, and a single, impossible act of mercy. The world snapped back into focus. In the adrenaline-fueled aftermath of the attack, a new, unspoken command structure had emerged. Isaac, the ranch owner, became the undisputed authority, his voice cutting through the chaos with sharp precision, and Mai, the prisoner, became his silent, efficient deputy. There was no language between them, only the universal syntax of triage. A pointed finger, a held-out strip of cloth, a shared glance over a wounded man. It was a grim and intimate partnership forged in the space of a few heartbeats. Isaac worked with a desperate fury to save his men, and Mai, her own fear locked away, worked to help him. She held a compress on one man's leg while Isaac stitched a deep gash on another. Their movements synchronized as if they had been training together for years. Private Gus simply stood, his rifle lowered, a ghost in his own drama. The clear, simple lines of hatred that had defined his world had been irrevocably blurred. He watched the Chinese girl, the threat, press a clean cloth to a wounded ranch hand's side, her small hands firm and steady. He saw Isaac nod at her, a gesture not of a captor to a prisoner, but of one professional to another. The scene did not compute. It was a glitch in the brutal logic of the frontier, and Gus had no orders for how to proceed. So he did nothing, a statue of obsolete conviction. When the last of the wounded, including a stabilized Ben, were made as comfortable as possible, an eerie quiet settled over the wreckage of the barn. Mai finally stood up, her body trembling with delayed shock. Her hands and forearms were coated in drying blood, a grotesque parody of long evening gloves. She turned to rejoin the other Chinese women who were huddled together at the far end of the ruined shelter. But as she approached, they shrank away from her. One of them whispered the word Hanjian, traitor. Her act of mercy was, to them, an act of ultimate betrayal. She had aided the White Devils. She had touched them, helped them, and was now stained by their blood. In saving an enemy's life, she had become an outcast among her own people. Isaac saw the exchange. He saw the fear and accusation in the women's eyes and the profound, crushing isolation that descended on Mai. A few minutes later, he approached her, holding out a bucket and a basin of clean water. He said nothing, simply set it down before her and walked away, giving her space. The act was louder than any words. It was an acknowledgement, a thank you, and a gesture of solidarity. As Mai plunged her hands into the cool water, watching the American's blood swirl and dissipate, she felt a strange and terrifying sense of release. She was unmoored, adrift between two worlds, belonging to neither. News of the incident traveled with the speed of frontier gossip. A rancher's life saved by a Chinese prisoner was a story too strange not to tell. By the next afternoon, it reached the ears of those who dealt not in bandages but in land grants and legal leverage. Mr. Davies, an agent for Bartholomew Kane's railroad, was a man who saw the world as a collection of assets and liabilities. He arrived in a buggy that was conspicuously clean, his suit crisp, his eyes holding a polite but analytical sharpness. He had heard about the raid and saw an opportunity. "Mr. Hawthorne," Davies began, his tone disarmingly casual. "I understand you have a cooperative asset among the Chinese you're harboring." "She's a cook, Mr. Davies." "She just reacted," Isaac said, his posture immediately defensive. "Her reaction demonstrated a capacity for logical self-preservation, Mr. Hawthorne. Perhaps even a disillusionment with the Tong's fanaticism," Davies countered smoothly. "That makes her valuable. Mr. Kane is desperate for information on Feng's main stronghold in the Blackstone Hills. A prisoner who understands that cooperation is a better alternative to starvation is a prisoner we can work with. I'm here to ask her a few questions." The interrogation, as Davies called it, took place in the ranch's main house. It was just Mai, Mr. Davies, and Isaac, who insisted on being present. Mai sat on a wooden chair, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Davies began with simple questions, spoken through a translator, soft and non-threatening. But then the questions sharpened. He unrolled a topographical map of the region. "We know Feng has a command post somewhere in this sector," Davies said, his finger tapping a grid of canyons. "We believe it's connected to their main supply cache. You were with them, weren't you, Miss Lin?" Mai stared at the map, her heart pounding. She knew the place he was pointing to. She knew the network of hidden trails that snaked through it, the hidden caves where men she had cooked for were now planning their resistance, prepared to die for their cause. To give them up would be the final, unforgivable act of betrayal. It would be to actively take up arms against her own people. But to refuse, what would this powerful man do to her then? She looked up, her terrified eyes finding Isaac's. He stood by the doorway, his face grim, powerless to stop the proceedings. He had shown her a different kind of humanity, but he was still just one man against the railroad that wanted her secrets. Mr. Davies leaned forward, his voice a confidential whisper. "Young Ben has a mother and two sisters back in Laramie. You saved their son and brother. Help us save more American sons. Help us end this conflict. Tell me where the stronghold is." Her past and her present converged in that single, terrible question. Duty versus survival, loyalty versus a nascent, fragile morality. All the lies and all the truths of the past week had led to this moment. The silence in the room was a physical weight. Mr. Davies's question hung in the air, a demand for allegiance. My gaze shifted from Davies's expectant face to Isaac's, whose expression was a tight mask of conflicting duties. He was a rancher protecting his own, but he was also a witness. He had bandaged her hand, she had saved his man. This was the transaction that now sat on the scales. Her mind, a whirlwind of fear and duty, finally found a still point of clarity. It wasn't about choosing a side. It was about choosing a meaning for the blood that was on her hands. She took a slow, steadying breath. "I cannot tell you about Feng's stronghold," she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet clear and firm in the quiet room. The translator relayed the words. Mr. Davies's expression tightened slightly. But Mai continued, her eyes locking with his, "I can tell you something else. 2 days ago, I overheard a plan to attack a settler wagon train passing through the Aspen Creek Pass." She pointed to a different spot on the map, miles from the Blackstone Hills. "It is a lie that it is for supplies. It is a trap. It is meant to provoke the cavalry. And the ones sent to attack are not Tong fighters. They are simple laborious, old men and boys given old rifles, told to make a final stand. Your soldiers will think they are attacking Tong warriors. They will walk into a slaughter, for both sides." Davies stared at her, then at the map. The information was specific, tactical, and, if true, incredibly valuable. It wasn't the prize he had been hoping for, but preventing a massacre that would bring federal troops swarming into the territory was a significant victory for the railroad's public image. It was also verifiable. He could send a rider to the nearest fort. He studied her face, searching for deceit, but saw only a profound and weary sincerity. He gave a curt nod. "We will look into it." The interrogation was over. As Isaac walked Mai back to the barn, the air between them was thick with unspoken words. The other Chinese women glared at her, their contempt a palpable force. Her betrayal was now complete in their eyes. Before he left her, Isaac paused. "Why?" he asked, the single word encompassing 100 questions. Mai looked at the white cloth still faintly visible on her palm. "The men you fight, the Tong, they are fighters. They have chosen their path," she said softly. "Those old men and boys on the wagon train, they have not. Your Ben has a family. Perhaps some of them do, too. No more ghosts." No more. It wasn't a full explanation, but it was the truest one she could offer. It was a logic born not of nations or companies, but of the simple human calculus of a healer. You save the lives you can. 2 days later, Isaac's ranch received an unexpected visitor, a cavalry patrol. The lieutenant in charge informed him that they had intercepted a raid on a settler train at Aspen Creek, disarming the attackers with minimal bloodshed. The rumor circulating was that an anonymous tip had averted a massacre. Isaac looked towards the horizon, his heart a tight knot of gratitude and awe. His final sight of Mai was the next morning. A wagon had arrived to transfer her and the other women to a federal outpost in Cheyenne. She was being herded on with the others, still an outcast among them. She saw him standing by the ruined barn, and for a moment their eyes met across the dusty yard. There was no time for words. He simply raised his hand in a small, almost imperceptible wave. She responded with a slight bow of her head, a gesture of profound, heartbreaking dignity. Then the wagon's canvas flap fell shut, and she was gone. The fight for the valley raged on for another brutal year. Bartholomew Kane eventually overreached, his violent methods drawing the attention of Washington, and Feng's resistance was finally broken. The railroad went through. The war ended. Isaac went on, carrying the ghosts of the men he couldn't save. But in the quiet moments, through all the long years that followed, his mind would return to that barn in the dust. He would remember the impossible choice and the quiet courage of a young woman who, caught between two warring worlds, chose to create a small, defiant piece of her own. She had not saved a cause or won a fight, but she had saved a piece of their shared humanity. And in the deafening silence after the last shot was fired, that small echo was the only victory that truly mattered.